Good morning, everybody. Welcome, welcome to another webinar in the DDHR Disasters, Displacement, and Human Rights webinar series for spring 2024. Today, we are very honored to have with us Dr. Ted Swedenburg, Professor Emeritus from the University of Arkansas. He will be speaking with us on his research and the work that he's done over many decades in Palestine. Dr. Swedenburg is Professor Emeritus at the University of Arkansas. He is the author of Memories of Revolt, the 1936 to 39 Rebellion, and the Palestinian National Past, which was published originally in 1995 and then reissued in 2003. He's also the co-editor of Palestine, Israel, and the Politics of Popular Culture, which came out from Duke University Press in 2005, and Displacement, Diaspora, and Geographies of Identity, also from Duke in 1996. His most recent publication on Palestine is Songs of Resistance in Diana Allen's edited volume titled Voices of the Nakba, A Living History of Palestine, which was published in 2021. Before I invite Dr. Swedenburg to begin his talk, I just wanted to say a couple of things about the Disasters, Displacement, Human Rights Program, and particularly the webinar series. The Disasters, Displacement, Human Rights Program is housed in the Department of Anthropology presently at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. Our webinar series are intended to draw critical attention to contemporary social crises as they impinge upon the physical, social, and economic well-being of human populations across the world. Spanning a range of foci, the series aims to invite conversation and dialogue by inviting scholars to discuss specific themes that link the study of disasters, displacement, and human rights to critical research into the inequalities, structural violence, as well as tenacious forms of popular critique and resistance that shapes our contemporary social landscape. If you'd like to get more information about DDHR, as well as our webinar series, please check out the Department of Anthropology's website. And I'll also post the link to DDHR's webinar series in the chat if you would like that. So without much further ado, I would like to hand this off to Dr. Ted Swedenburg. It's an honor to have you here with us, Dr. Swedenburg. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Swami. And it's a real honor to be with you all, and in part because I was canceled from speaking about these subjects at my own university. This is my first chance to talk about these subjects and at a university forum. It's about 6 months ago when I was supposed to originally speak, and 6 months later, I'm going to do something very different than I might have several months ago. And what I wanted, the 1936-39 revolt in Palestine was the focus of my field research and book. And so today I'm going to talk about it and draw a few connections and parallels with what's going on in Gaza and what has been for the last 6 months. And my field research in 1984, 1985 involved interviewing surviving veterans of the revolt who lived in the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and Palestinian towns and villages inside Israel. And here are a couple of the men that I interviewed, surviving veterans. This one from the village of Aqaba, located northeast of Nablus, and this one from the village of Sachnin, located northeast of the city of Haifa inside Israel. In April 1936, Palestinian Arabs launched a general strike that lasted 6 months and eventually turned into what became known as Thawra al-Kubra, the Great Revolt of 1936-39, the most significant anti-colonial insurgency in the Arab East during the interwar period. Its demands an end to Jewish migration to Palestine, an end to land sales to foreigners, and national independence for Palestine. The revolt's primary target was the British imperial sponsors of the settler movement. It was a revolt against a somewhat singular and exceptional form of settler colonialism, one sponsored by the League of Nations under the Mandate System, managed by Great Britain. and settled not by citizens of Britain, as you normally would find in a settler colony, but by diasporic, mostly European Jews. It has been the case since the rise of the settler enterprise in Palestine, since the late 19th century, that the project was simply not possible and not sustainable without the essential support of the imperial powers. Britain until after the Second World War, and today the USA. Although the insurgency erupted in Palestine urban centers, its focus rapidly shifted to the countryside. In May 1936, peasant guerrilla bands began to mount operations against British forces, primarily in the highlands of Palestine, what is today the West Bank and the Galilee. The rebellion was called off for a few months in October 1936 for the purpose of a British Royal Commission of Inquiry, but was relaunched again in September 1937 due to outrage over the Commission's report. The second stage of the insurrection reached its apex during summer and fall of 1938, when insurgents gained control of the highlands and most Arab urban centers of Palestine. But this apogee was short-lived relatively, and rebel power began to recede in the face of a massive British counteroffensive, and under that pressure, a fracturing from within. By September 1939, when war broke out with Germany, the revolt had been crushed. Here is the first point of direct connection between the 36-39 revolt and today's events in Gaza. Sheikh Izzeddin al-Qassam. Born in Syria, al-Qassam took refuge in Palestine in the early 1920s after being sentenced to death by French colonial authorities for his leadership of the resistance to French occupation in Syria. In Palestine, he took up a position as imam at the Independence Mosque in the city of Haifa, the country's most important port and chief industrial center, and he attracted large congregations composed of workers and lumpen proletariat, as well as peasants from nearby villages. He spoke out fiercely against British rule and Zionist colonization, advocating for spiritual renewal and political militancy as the appropriate means of confrontation. In the mid-1920s, he began secretly organizing and training cells of guerrilla fighters, recruiting from among urban workers and the peasantry. In November 1935, Qassam and a group of his men took to the hills of northern Palestine with the aim of raising widespread armed revolt, but they were discovered after only a few days, and the sheikh and 3 of his followers fell in battle. His martyrdom, however, electrified the Palestinian population, and it was a major spark to the revolt launched in March 1936. And several of his recruits, moreover, played leading roles as commanders in the armed struggle that ensued. Qassam's memory and his name continue to resonate in Palestine, most notably in the current era by the name that Hamas, founded during the First Intifada in 1987, chose for its armed wing, organized in 1991 or 1992, the Izzeddin al-Qassam Brigade, often known simply as Qassam. When the brigade began launching rockets into Israel from the Gaza Strip in 2001, these were dubbed Sawarikh al-Qassam, or Qassam rockets, or also simply Qassam. Regrettably, over the years, they've mainly hit civilian targets in contravention of international laws of war. The second point of important connection between the 1936-39 revolt and the current assault on Gaza is an item of Palestinian clothing, the kufiya, or as it is known in colloquial Palestinian Arabic, the hatta. As mentioned before, the revolt broke out in urban areas with the declaration of a general strike that lasted 6 months. This slide will have to stand in for a much larger discussion of all the impressive popular organizing that occurred during that strike and the significant role played by women during this period. At the same time, an armed revolt spread throughout the country, chiefly rooted in rural Palestine, and its fighters were, with perhaps one exception, all male. The conventional head covering for rural men was the kufiya, or hatta, and it marked the individual who wore it as someone from the countryside. Quite organically, it became de rigueur headgear for the members of the armed rebel bands doing battle with the British. The insurrection reached its height during summer and fall of 1938, when insurgents gained control of the highlands and most Arab urban centers. They undertook brazen attacks on colonial targets, like this one on Barclays Bank in Hebron, Al-Khalil. Many of the rebel attacks on British soldiers proceeded like this. Expecting a British patrol to drive down one of the major highways, rebels, often aided by villagers, would place obstacles in their path: boulders, tree branches, and brush, and the like. Soldiers who dismounted from their vehicles to clear away the rubble would be fired on from the hills on both sides of the highway. The British would engage them, try to chase them down, but guerrillas would typically fade away, hiding in caves or culverts in terrain that they knew much better than the colonial occupiers, or stashing their weapons and merging into villages as everyday residents. Railroads were also an important target. Not only were trains derailed and mined and shot at, but the sabotage also could involve the tearing up of train tracks. While we were doing field work in Gaza, we heard about one case in September 1938, when rebels organized local villagers to tear up railway tracks so as to prevent the arrival of a large body of British troop reinforcements from Egypt. 75 kilometers of track were affected and 7 kilometers of track torn up between Rafah, south of Gaza City, and Yibna village near Lid, an effort that involved the work of hundreds of villagers working at night. When repair work to the torn up track commenced, villagers organized an effort to prevent the sale of food to railway employees and to stop the hire of transport to railway staff. Even after repair was achieved, armed bands as well as villagers harassed trains, and on 28th of September, the hounding of the train and its escort at Khan Yunis, which you've heard about more recently, prompted the bombardment of the village with rifle grenades. Rebel commanders in this period also began to develop counter-state institutions, including a system of tax collection, an effective intelligence service, and the production of printed propaganda. Also, a rudimentary postal service. And note that what is depicted on this rebel stamp is the two most important Christian and Muslim holy sites in Jerusalem, the Dome of the Rock and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Most significant of the counter-state institutions and most troublesome to British authorities were the law courts, complete frequently with white-wigged judges, court stenographers, and printed law codes. These courts worked to judge and punish criminal behavior, including that of rebel fighters and commanders, to uphold local traditions of justice, and to resolve disputes. These courts were quite effective, and evidence from British archives tells us they were well regarded by the Palestinian public. A British physician who attended one session of a rebel court in Hebron observed that, quote, "Their justice and common sense does not appear to me inferior, and their expedition is demonstrably many degrees superior to that of the British mandatory courts." Palestinian scholar Mustafa Kabha, in his study of the revolt courts, reproduces a document of a judgment in August 1938 by rebel commander Abdurrahim al-Hajj Muhammad, who also served as president of the High Court of Appeals. And you saw his photo in the first slide I showed. This story may surprise you, and it's worth going on a bit about it. It concerns the case of a Jewish engineer, Yehoshua Dafna, captured and sentenced to death by a rebel district court. Dafna appealed, and so the case went before Abdurrahman, who, based on testimony from several Arab witnesses on the engineer's behalf, and the finding that Dafna did not support Zionism, ruled that he should be released. Other factors in the commander's decision were the fact that a death sentence would be catastrophic for his family and young children, and, quote, the court's belief in the famous Arab concept, granting clemency from a position of power. So the court released Dafna without accepting the 1,000 Palestinian pounds he had offered as ransom, granted him £5 in cash plus clothing, and returned him to the place where he had been seized. As rebels developed their shadow infrastructure, the insurrection's peasant and lower class character crystallized, threatening not just the British administration, but the hegemony of the Arab elite. Revolt commanders instructed urban residents to stop using the electric power produced by the Anglo-Jewish Palestine Electric Company, a concession that was held by a Russian businessman named Pinchas Rutenberg, who regarded the electric grid as a Zionist nation-building enterprise. The guerrillas extracted heavy, quote, contributions to the national movement from wealthy Palestinians. They declared a moratorium on all debts and warned both debt collectors and land agents not to visit the villages. Usurious loans were one of the chief means by which large Arab landowners exploited peasants. The command also canceled all rents on urban apartments, which had reached scandalously high levels. They warned Arab contractors and their workmen not to construct police posts and roads, and attempted to disrupt the orange harvests on plantations owned by big Palestinian landowners. Oranges, the famous Jaffa oranges, were chiefly exported to Britain. And the rebel command imposed subaltern dress codes on urban residents. In August 1938, as the revolt was taking control of urban areas, the rebel leadership commanded all Palestinian townsmen to discard the tarbouch or fez and don the kufiya. One reason for the command was that whenever fighters slipped into towns along with other villagers, their conspicuous headdress made them targets for arrest by the British Army. The new fashion spread across the country rapidly, but there was some opposition from urban elements, and so rebels resorted to force to make reluctant urban residents put on this new lower status garb. Previously, urban residents, and especially the upper and middle classes, demonstrated their social superiority by either wearing tarbouches or fezes, or if they were more modern, going bareheaded. The kufiya, on the other hand, marked one as a villager, lower class, a peasant, or a Bedouin nomad. This slide is an excellent depiction of the effect of the order, as the YMCA in Jerusalem was an urban and very middle-class institution. Prior to the order, it is very unlikely that any of its members would have worn kufiyas. And as rebel power receded in the face of a massive British counteroffensive and due to British pressure fracturing the movement from within, British police and soldiers pressured urban men to reassume the tarbouch or fez and throw off the kufiya in the course of reestablishing order. It was only some 30 years later, with the rise of the armed Palestinian resistance movement in the mid-60s, that the kufiya was revived as a national symbol. And it was indelibly associated with the Palestinian resistance movement from this period. And I now skate very briefly over its subsequent history, about which I've written extensively. The kufiya was gradually adopted during the 80s by many progressives in the West, and you saw any number of people donning it at demonstrations against US intervention in Central America, against apartheid in South Africa, against nuclear weapons. Its meaning shifted again with the outbreak of the first Palestinian Intifada in 1987, when it becomes associated with Palestinian civilians confronting armed Israeli occupiers in the West Bank and Gaza Strip with rockets and slingshots and the odd Molotov cocktail. In the aughts, and not coincidentally, at the time of the onset of the so-called War on Terror and the 2003 invasion of Iraq, the kufiya gets incorporated into the production of many fashion designers. It is donned by any number of celebrities, is sold by many retail outlets like Banana Republic, and it goes multicolored. And at the same time, it still shows up at progressive manifestations. After October 7th, 2023, and the murderous Israeli assault on Gaza, the kufiya goes truly global, and it shows up in multitudes at every public expression of opposition to genocide and in favor of an immediate and permanent ceasefire. It is ubiquitous. It is everywhere. And whether one is in favor of a ceasefire or adamantly opposed or doesn't care, you know what it signifies. Its ever-presence serves as a reminder that global support for Palestine, including in the US, is now at an all-time historic high. The point I want to emphasize here is that its origins as a symbol of Palestinian nationalism are in the great 1936-39 revolt, and that although this fact is often forgotten or actively suppressed, it is a sartorial symbol that was imposed from below by peasants in a moment of social upheaval in the midst of the anti-colonial rebellion. For the rest of the presentation, I want to turn to the repression of the 1936-39 rebellion. At the time of the revolt, Great Britain was still the world's premier colonial power. It disposed of massive military resources, and it felt its strategic position in the Middle East was threatened by the Palestine rebellion. And so Britain's response to the first wave of the revolt in 1936 was to organize the largest movement of British troops since World War I, numbering 25,000, transferred from Egypt, which was under British occupation. At the height of the insurgency, starting in August 1938, the Imperium mobilized as many as 30,000 British troops in Palestine, including elements of the Royal Air Force and Royal Navy. The total number of troops in the British Army in the interwar period totaled 180,000, meaning that over 10% of the Imperial Army of the far-flung empire was deployed in Palestine. British commanders in Palestine could also call on the British-led Trans-Jordan Frontier Force of over 1,000 men. And due to the collapse of the effectiveness of Palestinian Arab police by 1938, new police were recruited from Britain, and the force turned into a semi-military outfit. A number of the force's high-ranking officers came from what were known as the Black and Tans, the auxiliary police brought to Ireland by the British in their effort to suppress the Irish Rebellion in 1919 and 1920. And they were notorious for the counterinsurgency tactics they used in Ireland, but employing the same methods in Palestine, these were hardly criticized. In addition, to help fill in the policing gap, the British recruited thousands of Jewish supernumeraries, or extra police. By early 1939, Britain had aided in training and arming some 16,000 Jews in paramilitary forces known as the Jewish Settlement Police. Their duties were chiefly to guard Jewish colonies, but these also included around 500 men mobilized in, quote, mobile patrols, which were charged with attacking rebel units. I'll talk a little bit more about these later. The British also developed close collaboration with Zionist intelligence services. The practices implemented in the course of the pacification of the 1936-39 revolt were based in an array of emergency regulations designed to enable the Mandate administration and the British military to supersede the normal legal regime. Colonial emergency law was rooted in the notion that colonial subjects, accustomed as they were supposedly to despotic rule, were not yet evolved enough to live in a liberal legal regime like England's, and therefore harsh measures were often necessary in order to instruct them. On the basis of the emergency regulations in Palestine, the British Army decreed, for instance, that any Palestinian caught with weapons, even a single bullet, could be summarily tried and executed. Over 100 Palestinians so accused met this fate. Sheikh Farhan Saadi, an important rebel commander in the Jenin area and a follower of Hassam, was the first rebel tried and executed for this offense. His trial in military court lasted 3 hours. He was hung in November 1937 while fasting for Ramadan, and despite the pleas of his lawyers for mercy on the basis of his advanced age. Maybe he was 75 or 80. Blowing up houses and at times even whole villages in retaliation for rebel attacks in the vicinity was a common form of collective punishment, and straight from the Irish playbook. One of the most spectacular acts of destruction occurred in October 1938 after the rebels assassinated Assistant District Commissioner Walter Moffat in the city of Jenin. Moffat was thought to have been a particularly brutal colonial administrator, and it was claimed he had executed Palestinians who did not hand over hidden guns. His alleged assassin was shot trying to escape. The devastation at Jenin was substantial, and one British observer, unusual for her lack of sympathy for the actions of the colonial authority, asserted that the city had been, quote, savaged by, quote, blowing it or a large part of it to smithereens. Here are houses blown up in a village, Halhul, in the Hebron district, leaving families unhoused. Bombing by the RAF, of what the British categorized as a bad village from the air, using the most advanced war technology of the time. Soldiers marking a Palestinian house for punitive demolition. What's shown here was a very frequent counterinsurgency tactic. Why? Because the rebels were from the peasantry and they depended upon peasant villagers to hide them from British searches, to feed and house them as they roamed around the hills, to smuggle weapons, and so on. So it was standard counterinsurgency practice for soldiers to demolish the houses of villagers, arrest and beat them, and sometimes destroy their stocks of provisions with the aim of undermining the popular base of the rebellion. While we did research, we heard many times, many times, especially from elderly women, stories of soldiers breaking into their houses, ripping apart the insides, and pouring the supply of olive oil over the grains and pulses. These tales of the soldiers mixing and thereby ruining the zayt zaytun wa adis olive oil, lentils, and rice were seared into memory as a veritable economic atrocity, and a memory no doubt also kept alive by the fact that such punitive operations against villages were a major factor in the severe problems of hunger that afflicted the population by fall 1938. Another frequent tactic used by the rebels was to place mines on the roads and railways traveled by military convoys. The army commonly made Palestinians ride with the convoys to prevent mine or sniping attacks, tying hostages to the hoods of trucks or putting them in a flatbed in the front of trains. Another practice taken from the Irish counterinsurgency experience. Some army drivers would even brake very hard at the end of the journey and then run over the Palestinian who fell off the hood of the truck, killing or maiming him. Yet another tactic deployed by the army was mass detentions. The emergency regulations made legal the roundup of massive numbers of Palestinians on the basis of mere suspicion to be held, often for weeks at a time. The roundups often involved holding people in outdoor open-air cages surrounded by barbed wire, which the British authorities themselves called concentration camps. No food or water was provided to detainees. These had to be provided by families of the prisoners. Those held were simply suspects, rounded up in search and sweep operations, and were mostly villagers, although some notables like Hana Asfur were so detained. Abuse was common. Inmates were frequently made to do forced labor. The worst atrocity connected to the concentration camps occurred at the village of Khathul near Hebron in May 1939, when 11 villagers held in an open wire cage died after several days outside due to hot weather and insufficient supplies of water. As an aside, it's reportedly 100 degrees Fahrenheit today in Gaza. One scholar has estimated that over 500,000 people were incarcerated for various periods of time and held in various locations, prisons, jails, cages, during the 1936 revolt, which is around half of the Arab population of Palestine. The Mandate authorities encouraged the opening of universities for the Jewish population. 2 were opened during the Mandate period, the Technion in Haifa and Hebrew University in Jerusalem. But as typical colonialists, the British both considered the Arabs of Palestine to be too backward to be suitable for higher education, while at the same time they worried that higher education for a colonized population posed a danger. They would learn nationalist ideas, revolutionary ideas, develop national history, and so on. So they discouraged the opening of a Palestinian Arab university. What the Palestinian Arabs did, therefore, was to develop and expand the curriculum of secondary institutions that trained teachers. The Arab College in Jerusalem was the most important of these, and it did an excellent job of training students who went on to higher education at regional institutions, most notably the American University of Beirut, where incidentally I received my BA, and one of our AUB history professors, that was my major, was a graduate of this Arab college, and the American University in Cairo, where I taught for 4 years. The occupation of this institution by British forces constituted yet another form of collective punishment, a form of pressure on a very important proto-national Palestinian institutions. And of course, we all know that all universities in Gaza have been deliberately destroyed. Another form of collective punishment as part of the effort to stamp out popular support for the rebellion was the establishment of police and military outposts known as punitive posts or pickets in so-called problem villages. The burden of provisioning the outpost was imposed upon villagers who were required to pay for their jailers, feed them, and often provide housing. Such pickets could last for several months. In addition to punishing villagers for aiding the rebellion, the presence of the posts permitted soldiers to keep a close eye on its residents and on the local area. The British Army also introduced a pass system that put severe pressures on Palestinian access to food and their ability to conduct commerce. Let me point out just a few more elements of Britain's full spectrum counterinsurgency efforts that landed with particular force in response to the rebellion's upsurge in summer 1938. And I don't really have proper pictures for these. Heavy fines in money and kind, including livestock, imposed on villages located in the vicinity of rebel attacks. Forced labor imposed on both prisoners and non-prisoners, involving in particular road construction to enable better military access to rural areas. Whipping as a form of corporal punishment. Shooting suspects who ran off when British patrols showed up in villages. Murdering captured rebel prisoners. Press censorship. Ubiquitous curfews lasting sometimes for days. Internal banishment. British police death squads known as special squads. The arming and subsidizing of counter-revolutionary Palestinian militias known as peace bands. Some of them were led by former rebel commanders like Fakhri Abu Hadi, who served as a commander in 1936, but was subsequently put on the payroll by the British consul in Damascus, became a peace band commander, and carried out many attacks against the rebels in 1938 and 1939. The exile of urban Palestinian leaders to as far away as the Seychelles Islands in the Indian Ocean off the coast of Africa. These are members of the Arab Higher Committee, the urban leadership of the rebellion in its early stages, members who did not manage to escape arrest. In the upper right-hand corner is Fouad Sabah. He is the grandfather of a friend and classmate of mine from the American University of Beirut, with whom I'm still in contact, who now lives in the United States. The Arab Higher Committee was dissolved in October 1937, and all other political and semi-political organizations were dissolved and their leaders arrested. As Rashid Khalidi has recently observed, this was a constant. Palestinians have never been permitted to decide who represents them. Charles Taggart was brought in as a counterinsurgency expert from India, where he was a police advisor involved in police efforts to contain the Indian anti-colonial movement. He played a major role in beefing up the police force with British officers, and he was responsible for the construction of what is known as the Taggart Wall, which ran across Palestine's border with Syria and Lebanon. The wall made difficult rebel escape across the border, as well as hindering the smuggling of men and supplies. All along the wall were placed mines, police posts, pillboxes, and searchlights. It was constructed at a huge cost, roughly £1 million. Taggart also notoriously was involved in the operation of a network of torture centers, known euphemistically as Arab investigation centers. Taggart is also important for the construction of what are known as Taggart forts, massive structures, 62 of them constructed throughout Palestine to house police. Some are still used by Israeli police. And incidentally, the Taggart fort at Khan Yunis in the Egyptian-controlled Gaza Strip was destroyed in August 1955 in the course of an Israeli attack that killed 72 Egyptian soldiers. It was in response and revenge for incursions and assaults by what were known at the time as Palestinian infiltrators, for which Israel held Egyptian authorities responsible. The Taggart fort at Khan Yunis held a company of Egyptian infantry as well as headquarters personnel. The Special Night Squads, or SNS, were an unofficial counterinsurgency force sponsored by the British military and organized and commanded by British Colonel Orde Wingate, a fierce, eccentric Christian Zionist. And if you read about him, you would just regard him and his co-commander, also British, as really true psychopaths. The stated purpose of the night squads was to protect from rebel sabotage the strategically critical Iraq Petroleum Company, IPC, pipeline that pumped oil from Iraq to Haifa to fuel and was fuel essential for the British Navy. The SNS was a joint Jewish-British unit that included several Jews who became military leaders during the 1947-49 war, most prominently Moshe Dayan and Yigal Allon. The night squad methods were critical to the battle plans of the Palmach, the elite fighting force of the Haganah, the Jewish community's underground army, during the period of the British Mandate, and later for the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, in the implementation of the Nakba. The doctrine that Jewish officers learned from the British, as Rashid Khalidi recently summed it up, holds that by attacking preemptively or in a retaliatory fashion with overwhelming force and by striking directly at civilian populations considered supportive of insurgents, the enemy can be decisively defeated, permanently intimidated, and forced to accept the terms of the colonizer. The operations of the SNS soon expanded as they took on the task of going after Palestinian rebels. And they used the most ruthless of methods. Wingate and his men carried out many atrocities and executions of a number of prisoners. And a typical SNS operation, when taking revenge for a rebel attack, involved going to a nearby village, choosing several men at random, executing them on the spot. Wingate's methods eventually caused so many complaints that the army eventually shut down the SNS and sent Wingate home. For his service to the empire in Palestine, Wingate was awarded a Distinguished Service Order. But the methods he employed in training Zionist settlers in colonialism lived on. And it should be noted, too, that Wingate's SNS were not unique in the bloody methods that they employed. For other British infantry units also enjoyed tough reputations, and they employed the same bloody methods. And it's important to recall as well that General Bernard Montgomery, or Monty, the hero of El Alamein during World War II, arrived to be commander of the divisional area in which the SNS was located later in the squad's career, and he was a supporter and advocate of their methods. And there are a number of famous World War II generals who served in Palestine in the counterinsurgency effort. Now to turn to the long-lasting and broader effects of the suppression of the revolt. During the course of our fieldwork, we made a stop at Achziv, a popular Israeli tourist and recreation spot on the shores of the Mediterranean, located on the site of the former Palestinian village of Azib. It contains a national park, and all the placards in the park and all the guidebooks describe the medieval atmosphere of the remaining buildings, the quaint houses, and talk of Phoenician ruins. That is to say, all the Palestinian Arab remains are described as anything other than Palestinian Arabs. Here too, there's a Club Mediterranee and a youth hostel inside the large house of a former Azib residence, which displays many of the possessions of its former owner, including the dresses of his wife. Across the road from the park is Kibbutz Gesher Haziv, built on the lands of the former village. The displays and the naming encapsulate the story of the conquest of Palestine by Israel, physical erasure accompanied by epistemic erasure. During the 1936-39 revolt, the deadliest atrocity committed by the British was probably the massacre at the village of Al-Bassa, a village close by Azib, in September 1938. After 4 British soldiers were killed when their armored car drove over a mine planted by rebels near Al-Bassa, soldiers entered the village and shot 4 people in the street. They then gathered together and beat Al-Bassa inhabitants and took 100 of them to a military base for further beatings and torture. Next, they grabbed 50 men of the village, put them on a bus, and forced the bus to drive over a landmine placed by soldiers. Some 20 Palestinians were killed as a result. Villagers were forced to dig a pit, collect the bodies, and toss them in. The village was then destroyed as well. In the course of all this, some villagers from Al-Bassa told the soldiers that the villagers from nearby Azib were in fact responsible for planting the mine. So the soldiers proceeded to Azib village and destroy it as well, along with torturing a number of villages. And here you can see on a current map the location of what used to be Azib and is now Achziv National Park and Gesher Haziv. Azib was ethnically cleansed in May 1948. According to Israeli historian Benny Morris, the Haganah had a long account with Azib, and he writes, the villagers under mortar barrage and fearful of Jewish retribution for their past anti-Yeshuv, that is to say, Jewish community activities, fled during the battle. Refugees from Azib told Palestinian historian Nafez Nazal that the attacking Haganah soldiers wore red and white kufiyas and thereby tricked the village's defenders into thinking that their Arab brethren from the Liberation Army that had intervened in the war had come to rescue them. Azib's small force was overwhelmed and the village was rapidly emptied of its 1,900 souls. Only the dead, wounded, and a handful of elderly people remained behind. Joseph Weitz, chairman of what was known as the Transfer Committee, the semi-official body charged with preventing Arab refugees from returning, advising the government on further expulsions, and organizing and overseeing the destruction of Arab villages, visited Azib in December 1948, and he observed that the village of Azib had been completely leveled, and he wondered if it was good that it was destroyed, and would it not have been a greater revenge had we now settled Jews in the village houses. The bulk of refugees from Azib later settled at the Ain al-Helwi refugee camp near Sidon, Lebanon. They named their quarter of the camp Azib and is still known by that name today. Nearby Al-Bassa, and the location of Al-Bassa is where Betzet, a Jewish community established on its lands, underlined there. It was occupied by Zionist forces in May 1948 as well. Its occupants fled, many of them, according to an account by historian Nafez Nazal, after a few of the younger people were taken and shot. These were methods learned from fighting alongside the British during the Great Revolt, and they too became refugees in Lebanon. And we heard many stories like this doing research in Palestine from eyewitnesses of people being lined up and shot. One of my classmates and friends at the American University of Beirut, Rashid Hamid, was from Ain al-Helwi camp, someone who managed to get into that elite university with an education in the refugee camp UNRWA schools. I don't recall if he was from Azib. On May 15th, 1974, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine launched a very bloody and what I consider a very misguided terrorist operation at the Israeli town of Ma'alot. Israel retaliated on May 16th in Lebanon, destroying Nabatea refugee camp in the south and doing severe damage to Ain al-Helwi, killing around 50 Palestinians. On May 17th, I got married in Beirut and went on a honeymoon. My parents, who had moved to Beirut in 1973 to Holland, and my brother were in Lebanon for the wedding. A couple of days later, after we left for honeymoon, my dad and my brother went to Ain al-Helwi and to Nabatea and took a lot of pictures. And this is one of damage to a building at Ain al-Helwi. I have no idea whether any of the Azib refugees lived here, but this gives you some idea of the trajectory of Palestinian history since the defeat of the 1930s. And now for some concluding, at last, really scattered observations, I think. The revolt and its demise decimated Palestinian ability to resist. Most nationalist political and military leaders were eliminated or put in prison. Palestinians were disarmed. Many peasant militants were killed. At the same time, a much closer relation had been forged between British military and the Haganah, and the Zionist forces got training, experience, and more weapons, much of it courtesy of the British colonialists. The crushing of the revolt in 1938-39 set the stage for the Nakba. Palestinians were severely lacking in men, in leaders, in training, in the means and resources to fight once war broke out in 1947 and after partition was declared in 1948. Pitifully armed, poorly aided by the Arab states that intervened, it should be noted, to try to protect the territory that was designated by the partition plan for a Palestinian state. The disaster that was the Nakba ended with around 750,000 Palestinian Arabs displaced from their homes and some 418 Palestinian villages erased from the face of the earth, like Al-Bassa and Azib. Palestinians variously dispersed as refugees, living under military rule in Israel or under Jordan's rule in the West Bank or Egyptian rule in Gaza, were defeated as a national force and movement. If the world, and particularly the West, ever thought of Palestinians, it was only as hapless refugees sitting in squalor in dilapidated refugee camps. It was only after nearly 30 years, 3 decades, with the rise of the armed Palestinian resistance movement in the late 1960s, that a national movement would again be reconstituted and recognized, at least in many, if not all quarters of the globe, as legitimate. So yes, even in the face of defeat, Palestinians continue and have continued to resist, but history might suggest that the recovery from disaster and utter loss may not occur immediately. It might instead take a long time. Today, as many observers have noted, there is no unified Palestinian national leadership. Much of the literature on the revolt emphasizes the failings of the urban national leadership, the inability of the armed rebel leaders to develop a unified command, the harsh and on occasion criminal acts carried out against the population by guerrillas for the rebellion's failure. All of these factors are important, but I think most important of all to stress, and that's what I've stressed here, is the fact that the Palestinians were up against the world's most powerful colonial power. They were a relatively small population, and the strategic importance of Palestine motivated the British to mobilize the full weight of their military and coercive apparatus against them. And as Rashid Khalidi has recently reminded us, not a single anti-colonial movement other than the Irish was successful at gaining national independence during the interwar period. Not a single one. Not India, not Egypt, not South Africa, not Algeria. And I want to underscore once again that the Zionist settlers learned a great deal from the British and how, as Khalidi recently put it, to be colonialists, not just with the sort of military and counterinsurgency tactics learned in the SNS and other venues, but also how to divide a national movement by enlisting quislings, recalled the peace bands, and buying off leaders, and the legal mechanisms, many of the emergency regulations passed by the Mandate authorities for the purpose of crushing the opposition, were maintained in place by the Israeli state after 1948, and many remain in force and are still used today. And the Israelis, of course, continue to refine and expand those legal mechanisms in an ongoing effort to, as the British authorities put it when they launched renewed counterinsurgency methods in 1938, to screw down the population. So the Zionist settlement in Palestine could not have occurred without what the British did for them during their mandate, particularly in crushing the Great Revolt of 36 to 39. The settler colonial adventure in Palestine was only possible due to the intervention and military might of imperial power. That was true in the 1930s, still true today. And just as the British were in the 1930s in Palestine, today in Gaza, we, the Americans, are co-combatants, even if our soldiers are not on the ground there. There was little solidarity with Palestine in the 1930s outside the Arab world. And that came from countries that were under the thumb of colonial rule, making it difficult for that solidarity, widespread and popular as it was, to have much effect. The global solidarity with Palestine today is vastly superior, vastly, vastly superior. My cat is approaching my computer. Even if it's circumscribed still by the powers that be, who, despite the massive protests, continue to supply Israel with all that it needs, and to continue to impinge upon the freedom of the countries in the region to effectively support the Palestinians. All the Arab governments, with the exception of the Houthi regime in Yemen, are toadies of the imperial powers. We don't really know how this increased solidarity will play out, but I think it's important to remember that Israel cannot do what it is doing, and the Zionist settlement could not be successful without support of Britain and the imperial powers in Europe today. Finally, with this in mind, I want to advocate for the history of Palestinian resistance to colonial occupation and settlement. Advocate for it to be given its rightful due. Like all other national liberation movements, the Palestinian one has had its fair share of errors, criminal acts, and missteps, but fundamentally, the rebels of 1936-39 were fighting for freedom, for emancipation, for national sovereignty. The freedom fighters of 36-39 need to be regarded as heroes, just as all the heroes of the anti-colonial revolutions around the globe are so honored and revered and remembered. A good place to start would be this man, whose son Sonia and I interviewed in 1985, and about whom Sonia Nimmer has written an exceptional book chapter. Perhaps with all the amazing solidarity, it's absolutely remarkable as somebody who's been involved in various ways and known about this issue for 60 years. What's going on today actually really blows my mind. The amazing solidarity shown around the globe with Palestinians may be the special and exceptional stigma that has been attached to Palestinian resistance for so long, that honorable men like Abdurrahim al-Hajj Muhammad, the rebel commander, can be celebrated, honored, and studied, situated within a noble tradition and history of resistance and struggle for freedom. Thank you for listening and bearing with me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Swedenburg. There's so many questions come to mind, but I would like for our audience members to please use the Q&A. Dr. Swedenburg, you might want to keep the presentation on in case folks might want to kind of
Sure. Okay.
Slides.
Yeah.
And yeah, so audience members, if you have questions, please use the Q&A in order to post your questions. And I think, Dr. Swedenburg, you can see the questions yourself, but if you'd like for me to read them out to you, that I can do that as well.
Yeah, okay, let's see. Okay, let's see if I can get them. Okay. I just see one so far, but okay, so thanks me for a wonderful and emotionally difficult talk. Yes. So many continuities in history, some of which you noted, some of which is obvious from what you spoke about. My question is about national consciousness. How was Palestine as a nation felt, mobilized, realized before the 1936-39 revolt? And what effect on this did the revolt have? Obviously, today's Palestinian resistance movements have been greatly affected by this revolt, but how was national consciousness at that time affected? Fanon argued that violent resistance had the effect of unifying the people, and we clearly see this in the Algerian War. Was there a similar effect in Palestine? And that is a really terrific question that I think deserves like 17 books. But let's see if I can address a couple of points. Like many parts of the world that got colonized, Palestine, or what became Palestine, the name was there, but it was the area that's Palestine was divided under the Ottoman period into different governance. It wasn't one unified whole, and one could say that in the late Ottoman period, people in the cities really identified as citizens of the Ottoman Empire, especially as the Ottoman Empire reformed and as there were elections to parliament and so on and so forth. There were Palestinians in the Ottoman parliament, and the notables, the notables spoke. If they were very educated, spoke Ottoman Turkish, and so there was an effort to make them feel part of this empire, which, as recent scholars have been arguing, most notably, what's his first name? Mekdisi. I'm spacing out his name, has written a great book about this. But they saw themselves as citizens of this empire that was multi-ethnic and multi-sectarian, okay, so you have those folks, and then in villages, people really saw themselves, they're part of the empire, but they saw themselves as part of a clan or part of a village. They saw, they had much more local identification, as opposed to connecting to something called a nation called Palestine. But it's so yes, it's really as a result of it's as a result of, or in response to settlement that begins in the late 19th century. Opposition emerges that unifies more and more people. Then the British arrive. They call it Palestine, and one has to say that the peculiar case of Palestine, as opposed to the other mandates, was that the British never allowed for there to be a Palestinian, anything like a Palestinian government to take place. There was no parliament, there was no prime minister, there's no presidents, unlike Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, because the aim of one of the main purposes of the mandate was to establish this Zionist settler colony. So it was the repression of Palestinian efforts to stop this that really and the reaction of Palestinians that really crystallized the sense of national consciousness. So it's really through, it's a interaction, I would say, of repression, often very extreme, and then resistance to the repression. And the effect of repression was to inspire and cause more reaction, just as university presidents are experiencing right now today in the United States of America. Violent resistance. So I think it's the violence really is the British violence, and subordinately the Zionist violence that unites people, or that plays a major role in uniting people in the resistance. More so, I would say, I would say I don't know, I'm not sure that fighting together is what brought about national consciousness. It's rather the British repressing the Palestinians and then them fighting together against it. So I would give I think more agency to what the British and the Zionists did in bringing this about than the other way around. And the way in which you're talking about Fanon. But I hope that answers it. I mean, this is a very big subject. Sorry, I can only tell you a little bit about it. Okay, next question. And we could ask more about this. Oh, this is a great question. I love this. Thank you, Dr. Sweden, for this and for history. You mentioned Sir Charles Taggart and the Taggart Force. I guess I didn't mention that he was knighted for his heroic counterinsurgency work. I wanted to mention that Taggart served extensively in the Indian police from 1901 in Calcutta, Bengal, until moving to Palestine. His ruthless policing there became a model for policing in India. He was Irish. Yeah, I thought Dr. Swamy would appreciate this as well. In 1919, Michael O'Dwyer, Lieutenant Governor of Punjab, who was responsible for the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, sorry for butchering that, in Amritsar, in which up to 1,500 people were killed. He was also Irish. Yeah, yeah. And then there are a lot of Irish doing great things as well. But yeah, strange how they were able to divide and conquer and then use some of the Irish in this regard. Yeah, Taggart is not a great character, and thank you for bringing that up. I would just add to that methods employed in Palestine were then taken to Malaysia to use in fighting against the very long and heroic anti-colonial movement in Malaysia. And then one of the guys that served with Wingate was killed in Burma in 1943, so the colonial subjects did not have to endure his depredations. But the officer who worked with him later served in counterinsurgency in Cyprus. So these methods and the personnel, travel. And I mean, one of the things that I think is, I mean, I want to discredit all these bastard, excuse the expression, but I mean, they deserve it, bastard British military heroes like Taggart, Sir Charles Taggart, Wingate getting an award, Monty, right? And a bunch of other generals that I didn't name, but are famous in the British context for fighting during the Second World War. These guys were criminal, murderous, typical colonial repressors in Palestine and in many other places. And they get held up and honored, and nobody talks about Palestinians in this regard, or they're considered to be terrorists or brigands or criminals and so on. Yeah. Oh, there's more questions. Sorry. Let's see if I can find them. Oops, sorry about that. I'm sorry, I'm retired. That's what emeritus means, and so I'm a little out of practice.
I can read it out if you want to while you get the slide up. You mentioned in your book and in your talk divisions between socioeconomic class during the 1936 to 39 revolt. Would you make any connections today specifically related to the lack of a response by those in Ramallah to the genocide in Gaza?
Yeah, I think you're referring really to lack of response in Ramallah is really I think the person asking the question is asking the Palestinian Authority. Yeah, absolutely. Frankly, I was asked to do this, and I've just been paying attention to Gaza for 6 months, like many of you, and not thinking about the 1936-39 revolt. So I'm sort of, I mean, this occasion, pushed me to kind of think about parallels and connections. But I honestly have not. I'm at the beginning of thinking this through. So these are really, what I want to say, rudimentary thoughts and remarks. But certainly, yes. I mean, this is. It's not talked about very much, but I would say, I guess, not just the Zionists, but the Americans learned from this. What the British did, right? Because I mean, the Palestinian Authority today is just a henchman, subcontractor for the Israeli occupation forces, and they do their best to stop resistance, to throw people in jail and repress. They're simply junior officers of the Israeli occupation authorities, and they are much despised and hated by the Palestinian population. So when our president talks about we're going to have well, we need a Palestinian state, we're going to put the Palestinian Authority in power. I mean, they're quislings. They're like they're analogous to French collaborators with the Nazis during the occupation of France, and I think their fate in future is not going to be a very happy one. So they're propped up. I mean, and I think, frankly, thinking about the 36-39 revolt, the national leaders had their failings in that period, and they were too willing to talk to the British and make compromises, but they are much better and more honorable than the people that you've got sitting today, I think, in Ramallah, in my estimation.
So another question, I can read it out, or if you would like to read it yourself, that's fine as well. Okay.
For some
Okay.
reason, I'm not able to like yeah, just read it. Something's going wrong here. So
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm sorry. Thank you very much for your time and sharing your research. What is the historical intention behind the UN's proposal of a two-state solution in 1947? I find that the idea of a two-state solution does not address root causes and decades of loss. Is the two-state proposal still a widely believed solution, or does that only work to appease Israeli power?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's a tough and I think complicated one. And Palestinians are not really, I would say, united on the particular subject. And at this moment, it's, to me, it's hard to imagine what could happen in future, because we're in the process of a horrible, horrible assault on Gaza. Palestinians are traumatized, mad, furious. The rest of us who are paying attention sort of have second degree rage, trauma, fury. So we have at second degree I think we can relate in some small ways to what Palestinians are feeling. And then the Israelis are traumatized too by what happened on October 7th, and tens of thousands are displaced, are not, they can't live along the borders with Gaza and in northern Lebanon. And just like the Americans after 9/11, the majority of them have bloodlust and they just want to take revenge. And so it's very hard to imagine, like if there is a ceasefire, and who knows when this can happen. It's hard to imagine what would come after, right? Like, is it a two-state solution? Is it a one-state solution? Is it a confederation? It's easier to imagine a continued war, frankly, than it is to imagine imagine a peaceful settlement of any kind to this conflict. Yeah, the person asked about. I think it's just too much. It's too much to really talk very much about the partition plan of 1948. I mean, the Palestinians opposed it. The Arab states opposed it. They were too weak to do anything about it. And the Palestine Communist Party at the time, or accepted it because they were allied with Russia. And who knows, if they had accepted it, maybe things would have been better. I mean, it's I guess terrible to say, right? That if there was a Palestinian state and alongside the state of Israel, I don't know. This is speculative, but anyway, it's I guess I'm dodging the question but I think many people think the same thing. I mean, I want to see the two people at peace with each other, and living alongside each other, and in a non-coercive relationship to each other. It's hard to imagine what form that might take. But I appreciate I think the person who asked the question is correct in thinking that when the United States is talking about a two-state solution, A, they're not serious. B, if they were serious, in fact, it would be a state and then like something less than a real sovereign state next to the all-powerful state. And so whatever they're thinking about is pretty much nonsense and very repressive and not worthwhile discussing. But maybe there's possibility for a two-state solution.
So
Of some different sort. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
No, that's okay. So I have a question, Dr. Swedenberg. Uh, it's quite remarkable, and in your presentation, this sort of was at various points you mentioned this sort of almost a kind of close link between the resistance movement and the civil population, right, and the general population. And in that, you mentioned during many of these actions in the 1936 to 39 revolt, there was the active participation of villagers, of folks in the small towns, engaging in various kinds of activities to support the resistance. Why I find this particularly remarkable is because there is this tendency, even to this day, to reduce the Palestinian resistance to the actions of militants or the actions of some, as though the resistance movement is just sort of, this is akin to how the Confederate, sort of the Jim Crow South would refer to all civil rights activists as outside agitators, right? As if resistance only can come from outside. But it's quite fascinating to see the active involvement of the general population, especially in the example that you provided, the illustration of the railway that was disrupted, for many miles of railroad that was disrupted. I was wondering, could you say a little bit more about that, and also amplify on the role of women in some of these moments of the struggle in 36 to 39, because that is also another facet of the Palestinian resistance movement that constantly seems to be overshadowed by a focus on the so-called militants, and this assumption that they have no connection to the general population.
Right. It's a great question. And, I was doing most of our interviews along with the Palestinian woman, but we had, our focus was on the revolt and the armed revolt. But when we went to interview people, we were interested in talking as well, if we could, to the wives and I don't know, aunts or whatever of the fighters. The framing that we went into do the that we brought to our interviews meant that the men spoke and the women didn't say much, even though we'd ask some questions, right? Because you're talking about the revolt. Well, the revolt was men, right? So we got these guys were dying off, right, at the time. So we had a list, and then we of people that we wanted to see, and then so and so, Abu Muhammad died because it was really cold and not very good, so we were trying to find, we were scrambling to find these older men, right, who were they're elderly, and they don't their life expectancy is not as long as people in advanced capitalist countries. So the framing sort of meant that we didn't really get as much from women as we would have liked. So it's kind of fragmentary, but they did. I mean, the women that I think if the women did speak, most of them talked about, their husbands, comrades showing up in the house, and they're like, 20 men in there, and they got dirty boots, and they have to clean and feed them, and it was a burden, but they didn't really complain about it because they knew they were participating in something. And they talked about hiding men in wells so that they could escape. One woman told us a kind of an amazing story about how she was asked to transport a revolver from one area of fighting to another. So she got on a bus and had the revolver in her basket of food, and she was scared to the dickens. And she was like, 20 something. She wasn't even married, I don't think, then, right? 20 something. And so and then they suffered, right? I mean, these were the overwhelming stories that you'd get from women. It's like, they came in and this is like a meme or this is a very strong memory. The British came in and they tore the house up, and then they mixed our provisions for the year, right? We didn't have, so like, those are like, that's what people live on, especially at winter, is those, maybe they have an onion, right? Olive oil, lentils, rice, that's it, right? And so they don't have it. So that they were angry about that and had long memories of that. And people have studied these, stories in other places. And, hunger is the memory of hunger is a huge, huge thing. So, that's a few examples. And there's a much richer history, and some other people have studied it, and we don't have as many stories, but and I like that, at least I had that one photo of women, in the cities doing, out collecting money, and that the men were all getting arrested in the cities, the notable men, their wives, didn't get arrested and thrown in jail, and they organized and sent protests and had meetings of protest with the British officials. And in the archives, which I spent some time in the Colonial Office archives in England, there were lots and lots of correspondence by elite women complaining to the British and documenting atrocities and so on. So both at the level of, in the villages, and elite women, middle class, and even and elite women, they played, I think, an important role that should not be underestimated. But we were again, our interest was in, we wanted to get to these guys before they died, and we thought, I'm sorry, one more thing is that Palestinians, if they get involved in armed struggle against colonialism, this is not honored. They're the only anti-colonial armed struggle that, no, Palestinians aren't supposed to do this, right? And there's a taboo against, a kind of taboo against Palestinians carrying guns to fight the occupation. Anyway, that's enough about that. Yeah.
Well,
thanks for the question.
That was very helpful. There's another question here. Thank you for your presentation. I am guessing very few Americans know the horrors carried out by the British Empire in Palestine. I believe one of the problems in the current moment is the lack of imagination that Israel could actually carry out a genocide. You gave several examples of horrific violence in the 36-39 revolt. Would you agree that part of the problem is the lack of imagination in the current moment because of the lack of historical knowledge of the colonial period, and that what is happening now mirrors the colonial era? If people actually knew the history of Palestine, they could much easier imagine a settler colonial genocide today.
Yeah, it's a great question. And, there's so many more elements to this story besides the ones I have given. Palestinians could just rattle off massacre after massacre after massacre, not just those of the Nakba, which there's a vast literature about, and documentation that's growing about this. And I contributed. You mentioned, I contributed to one of those books about this recently, based on oral testimony. And a year after that incident in Khan Yunis that I mentioned, there's a horrible massacre in Khan Yunis. Joe Sacco, the cartoonist, has a whole, one of his best books, comic books, right? Graphic comic books, is about massacre at Khan Yunis. What happened at Sabra Shatila in 1982? We don't have to go back to 36, 39. I'm just interested because I got interested, and it's a great anti-colonial rebellion. So that's a great point, that the way that this issue is framed by our government and mass media and the people, various serious people who control discourse, is that really the only lives that matter are those of the colonists, and Palestinians who are killed. Well, in fact, and people have looked at newspaper headlines today. Palestinians never get killed; they die, or fighting happens. There's people have called this now the passive exonerative. in newspaper reporting. So it's always in the past, if Israelis, Israeli forces don't kill anyone. So yes, I think, but absolutely right that if this history were better known, then it could be imagined that Israel is capable of doing, what it is doing. I mean, Gaza was Masha Gessen writing, and I think in the New Yorker, wrote about this, I think, heroically. Gaza was not an open air prison, once it was put under siege in, what was it, 2007, I think, or 2008. It's a big concentration camp. It's a big concentration camp, and has been a concentration camp for what, 15 years. Like, just terrible conditions, especially for the mass of the poor population. So yeah, I mean, hopefully things are shifting a bit, but it's really late in the game, and the situation is dire. But yeah.
It also is really important to kind of look at the continuities, and I feel like your work really does a lot of incredibly important. There's a lot of important work that your research does here, Ted, and that you're looking at the continuities in terms of the kinds of strategies, technologies of power that are brought to bear. And you mentioned the sort of training and the lessons being learned by the Zionist kind of militias, etc. But I was wondering, and to kind of connect this up to an earlier question, there is a lot of sort of shared technology of power that's played out in the British Empire. And you mentioned Ireland, of course. There's India, and then you mentioned how many of these the lessons learned in the suppression of the Palestinian revolt then are applied in Malaysia and elsewhere, right? In the current moment, we're seeing a kind of similar phenomenon as well, in that you have this sort of hyper kind of very, very high technology training and new kinds of repression and so on and so forth. And this training is going not only from the empire's core to the sort of to settler colonial states like Israel, but also coming the other way. And I want to kind of like also ask you for your thoughts on this, the other direction of this phenomenon, as in the police training in the United States, in collaboration with various Israeli security apparatuses, and what we're learning from that via the brutal suppression. Over the last decade, we're seeing an increasingly ferocious police force in the United States, suppressing various kinds of protests and various forms of civil disobedience in the United States. And I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on that sort of generalization of repressive technologies that is going on right now.
Yeah, and that's a great question. And I think what's going on now is, I mean, Israel may be at the the pinnacle of advanced technological repressive mechanisms. I mean, it's a highly educated country with massive investment in high tech, all aspects of high tech, and then its advantage vis-a-vis many other countries is it has this very advanced capacity, and then it's been involved in continuous suppression of resistance for decades, right? And it's selling what it's using all around. I mean, when you have what do you call it? These what are they? Arms fairs or some international arms fairs. I mean, people are lining up at the Israeli, various Israeli tables to buy this stuff. So it's very scary I mean, if we had a fascist, highly authoritarian government come to power in the United States, we would and they didn't like you. We really would be dangerous for us to have phones or anything electronic with us because they control the phones and they're using phone technology to target anybody who has who looks possibly having anything to do with Hamas just based on all this data that's collected, and it's AI that's making the decisions on who to kill, and they want to kill people in their homes. I mean, it's terrifying what they've done. So yeah, it's a great point, and I think the relative weight of where this is coming from has shifted for a couple of reasons, because Israel is I lived there, I taught there. I mean, I've both lived in the West Bank, but I've taught inside Israel, and have hung out not as much as in the West Bank, but taught at an Israeli university. People are really, they're highly educated. And I taught at a university where, they wanted me and they were sympathetic to what I was doing in the Middle East Studies program. But, just like at our own universities, there's us teaching in the humanities, and there are people doing robotics and, whatever in AI and in the, technical field. So yeah, they're very advanced. And then the fact, just to kind of repeat the point, the fact that they're developing them on site, on the ground, in interaction with, using this stuff on Palestinians, facial recognition, all this stuff. I mean, they're at the top, and they're making this is a huge source of income for them. Nonetheless, they could not be doing what they're doing in terms of weaponry without the support, just the support of the United States. They can't, they have a weapons industry, but they don't have relatively, it's not that big a country, so they don't have the industrial capacity to produce arms the way the huge country of the United States, and I guess the Germans and the Brits too, have. So there's, despite their high tech capacity for waging, on the ground basic war, they're still very, very much dependent. So, our president could just say, stop it, and then it would stop immediately, but pretty quickly, I think things could ratchet down.
So one last question, Dr. Swedenburg. In recent years, there have been efforts in Kenya, most notably, to kind of hold Britain to account for the atrocities committed in the suppression of the Mau Mau rebellion. I was wondering, are there similar efforts or any discussions around holding the British to account for not only enabling and making it possible for the colonization of Palestine by the Zionist militias in '48, but also the ruthless suppression of the revolt itself? And as you've documented, the extreme forms of violence were deployed against the Palestinian population. Are there efforts to kind of hold Britain to account or raise awareness of the kinds of atrocities that were committed during that time?
Yeah, that is a great question, and these efforts are really important. And I think what the Kenyans have done and are doing is really a great, I think, model. That that's the Mau Mau and the suppression of the Mau Mau, and I would also say the epistemic violence done to Kenyans by like the name Mau Mau, we still use it, right? It connotes like savage, crazy people, right? When it was a noble anti-colonial rebellion, right? I mean, they just used the language of criminality and murderous activity to defame and this movement. So yeah, it's that is really important. There may be some efforts that I maybe have heard about and can't remember, and I think Palestinians are really more focused on more recent atrocities, right? I mean, it's just like how much energy do you have, and then what's closer and what's more important. A good friend of mine was involved in a several year effort to try to take Ariel Sharon to trial and to task for the massacre at Sabra and Shatila. It's not the only massacre that criminal was involved in. And actually she's an anthropologist, and basically in some ways wrecked her career by American anthropologist, but formerly married to a Lebanese guy. Yeah, kind of wrecked her career, and then, put her energy into this effort to try to, take down Sharon. And ultimately it failed, unfortunately, after all the, like just hard work. It's so, I don't know, maybe it would be easier to get to the Brits than it is to the Israelis these days. I hope something like this could be done. I mean, I'll just add, say as a kind of a side thing, right? And of course, this is not the Brits, but my partner in research, Sonia Nemmer, who, by the way, is a award-winning novelist or who writes for young adults fantasy, Palestine. I mean, it's fantastic stuff. Look it up. It wins award. I just read one of her books. But anyway, we were working together, and then we hired somebody who was who was detained under the old emergency regulations, who was a professor of physics. He was under house arrest for months. He was interested in this stuff, so he transcribed all our interviews, and so we have stack of them transcribed into Arabic. And
I think the sound and the video seems to have frozen. Did you get cut off? You need to unmute yourself.
I think my internet faded.
Okay.
But the Israelis, if I don't know, I'll go back with it. The Israelis have all they shut down the archive where our interviews were kept, and they have got them somewhere, right? So part of the story of, like, taking stuff, all this stuff is hidden somewhere in some, I think they call it abandoned documents. And they have huge archives of stolen books and records of things and so on and so forth that nobody has, people don't have access to. Luckily, we have our own copies, but my point is there's all kinds of major and minor crimes I've considered trying to, now that I'm retired, maybe trying to bring a case to get these recovered, because my work was funded by the Social Science Research Council. So Social Science Research Council research was stolen by an allied government. Anyway,
but
enough.
Was this the other archive, the big archive in Jerusalem? I think that was being threatened. Is that the Orient House? Is that also not?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, they took everything. They just took everything out of there. Yeah, stole it all.
Dr. Swedenborg, thank you for staying longer than you might have expected to, and
Oh, it's fine. Yeah.
because this is such a fascinating topic and so much amazing research you've done, and thank you for sharing your knowledge and your wisdom with us, and for taking time. Definitely, there will be more questions, and thank you all to the audience who joined us. Thank you so very much for being here. And please send emails if you have any questions about Dr. Swedenberg's research or about the DDHR webinar series or the DDHR program. I'll be more than happy to respond. And thanks again. I'll place the recording up for the general public on our website. And yeah, is there anything more? Do you have any closing thoughts you wanna sign off with, Dr. Swedenberg?
Free Palestine.
Thank you so very much.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. I enjoyed it. Thanks for the questions. Take care.